Good morning, Friendship Village.
Good morning.
Rule 1, turn off those phones. Phil Micklin was born in Gig Harbor, Washington, a fishing town across Puget Sound from Seattle. He grew up in Port Orchard, Washington, and stayed in the state for his BA, MA, and PhD at the University of Washington. His interest in the natural world led him to geography because it has both a social and natural science focus. During his 30-year career in the geography department at Western Michigan University, Phil published numerous books and articles and also worked for the State Department, NATO, and USA as a consultant. And a little while ago, he told me he worked for the CIA, so maybe he can expand on that.
A long time ago.
Phil Mickelson is considered an expert in certain areas of Central Asia and the former Soviet Union. His interest in the natural world led him to nature photography and bird watching. Phil served on the board of directors of the Kalamazoo Audubon Society. He was a long-distance runner for 34 years and has run the Old Kent River Bank Run. After graduating from college, Connie was living and working in Ann Arbor when her college roommate, her Kalamazoo college roommate, invited her to a party in Kalamazoo. As you can assume, the rest is history. It was there that Connie met this geography professor from Western Michigan, and they began a 3-year I-94 courtship. They were married in March of 1977. Connie and Phil have one daughter, Claire, who is a specialist in information technology at the University of Chicago. Phil has a son from a previous marriage who lives in Kalamazoo. Please welcome our neighbor, Phil Mickelson, who will present a research career on water management issues in the Soviet Union and post-Soviet states.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
No.
I'll speak really loud. I'll use my classroom voice.
Yeah.
Students never complained they couldn't hear me, so I'll talk very loud. I've naturally got a very loud voice. Okay, so I've got a bunch of PowerPoint slides to go through here, but I won't drag this out for a terribly long time, and I will leave enough time for people to ask questions, because I know from the many presentations I've given over the decades, that's very important. And sometimes the questions are more interesting than the presentation, so I promise to do that. Let's see. You've already had a good introduction to me, so I won't spend time on this. This is just sort of a repeat of the main things about my research career. That's a physical map of Asia, but most of it's taken up by the Soviet Union. And of course, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore, but for much of my research career, it did. And it was the physically largest country in the world, 2.5 times the size of the United States, and it had a population of 300 million, which at the time was significantly larger population than the U.S. Of course, you realize the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, and now what's left of it are 16 new nations that were the former republics within the Soviet Union. Okay, to get started on my various adventures in the Soviet Union, in 1966, when I was in graduate school at the University of Washington, my first wife, and a fellow graduate student, Phil Pride, and his wife decided we've got to go to the Soviet Union. We were both academically interested in it, so we took a boat from Montreal to St. Petersburg. It was a new luxury liner, and actually it was a pretty good trip. And then we went and visited various places in the Soviet Union. We went to the Ukraine, we went to the Caucasus, Georgia and Armenia, and then probably the biggest part of the trip, at least in terms of things we saw and learned, was a trip on the Trans-Siberian Railway, which runs from Moscow, the red line shows it, across the Ural Mountains, through eastern Siberia, through the Far East, and ends up at Vladivostok, the big port on the Pacific. You couldn't go, as a foreigner, you couldn't go to Vladivostok. Know why? Big Soviet naval base, and they weren't about to let foreigners who they thought all were spies, some were, they wouldn't let you go there. So we took the Trans-Siberian Railroad, which is about a week's trip. And part of it, most of it, the train was pulled, or the cars were pulled by electric engines, diesel electric, but part of it, they were pulled by an old coal-fired engine, black smoke pouring out of it. Okay, what was the most interesting thing we saw on the Trans-Siberian trip? Right here. You know what it is? I forgot to put a title on it. It's Lake Baikal, which is really world famous because it is the deepest lake in the world, and the volume of water in Lake Baikal is actually a little bit more than all of the Great Lakes put together. It has very unusual life in it. It has seals, freshwater seals. And I can't remember if we saw a seal or not. And it had lots of fish, and some of them are extremely tasty. One in Russian called an omul, who had a very famous reputation in the Soviet Union. So we stayed in several days at Lake Baikal. We went to the Lake Baikal Institute, which was very interesting. And the water of Lake Baikal is extremely pure, some of the most pure water in the world. So guess what the Soviets planned, the Soviet government, and built a pulp and paper mill right near the lake. And the Soviets, even though that was, a time when there was not a lot of freedom there, they complained. And in the, can't remember the name of it, I think it was called Soviet Union, the English language magazine, there was an article about the complaints. And they actually succeeded in getting pretty tight pollution controls on the plant. The plant's closed now. And they declared Lake Baikal the first national park within the Soviet Union. So it's reasonably well protected today. Let's see. Okay. I became, actually, during my dissertation work, which was on the Caspian Sea, which is what? The world's largest lake. It's brackish water lake, somewhat saline, but it's a gigantic lake. Anyway, during my work on it, I came across information that the Soviets were planning to transfer water from the Siberian rivers and some of the northern European rivers southward to try and solve some of the water problems in the more arid regions of the country. And I got interested in these projects because they were huge, terrifically expensive, and it looked like they could have some significant environmental effects. And what you see here, the blue lines are, let's see, I've got a cursor here if I can do it. See this one, that was a European project to take water from the Arctic flowing rivers, Pechera and Vycheda, and send about 40 cubic kilometers, which is a gigantic amount of water, southward into the Volga, and put it into the Caspian Sea. A lot of the water would be used for irrigation in the more arid regions of southern European Russia, and it would be used to stabilize the level of the Caspian Sea, which at that time was dropping. And then the other planned diversion, if I can get this thing to move, right here, was the so-called Siberian diversion, even planned to be even larger, up to 60 cubic kilometers a year. Again, a huge amount of water to be taken from the Ob River and the Irtysh River. The Irtysh is a tributary of the Ob, and they flow into the Arctic, okay? And the Ob is a huge river, not among the very largest rivers of the world, but quite large. And I got interested in these. What are the environmental effects? Are they really going to go ahead with this? So that launched me into a study of the diversion projects. And here's a closer up view of satellite images, or at least on the left is a satellite image, and then a map on the right of the Siberian diversion project, which by a significant amount was the largest project. And they were quite serious about this. They were designing the dams they had to build with specialized equipment and surveying the routes. And it looked like they were going to go ahead with the projects. And they actually started work on the European project, survey work and building some things. Okay, well, I got interested in what the effects would be of the both the European and the Siberian. And this is one of the diagrams that I produced, which was intended to show how complex the effects could be from the Siberian diversion. And you can, this is a model, but it's not a quantitative model. In other words, I can't come to quantitative answers. But it pointed out what some of the major consequences would be. And I submitted the article to one of the publications of the American Geophysical Union, EOS Transactions, and they accepted it. So I got this diagram and some other ones published. That was early 1980s. Well, again, I'd like to point out that the Soviets weren't the only ones considering grandiose water transfer projects. We were doing it here in the United States. The project was called NWAPA, North American Water and Power Alliance, which had been developed by the Ralph Parsons Engineering Company. They did the Congress, one of the committees in Congress did a big study on it. And the representatives and senators from the drier regions of the US, the Southwest particularly. They were all in favor of NWAPA. And this was in the 1960s. And they set the cost at that time at $100 billion, so this was not cheap. And on the right here, the diagram on the right, I know you can't see the details, but all the black on there is where the water would come from. They were gonna transfer water from Alaska and Northwest Canada down through the Canadian Trench and into North America, and then send it all over the place, some even to Mexico. How close to implementation was this project? Lots of opposition to it on environmental grounds and on states' rights grounds. You can imagine what Canada thought about it. A disaster. You're taking our water? They're gonna send it down to your dry regions? No way. So that would have been a huge impediment to them actually going ahead with this project. And as the environmental movement grew in the 1970s, this project faded. So the chances of them ever implementing it are not zero, but close to zero. You know, what the Great Lakes states did is sign a compact, a water cooperation compact, and it said no transfers of water outside the Great Lakes Basin. They have violated it in tiny ways by allowing some communities near Chicago that aren't in the Great Lakes Basin to get water from the Great Lakes. But huge transfers are just, were out of the question. And in fact, one of the plans was to take water from Lake Superior, send it to the Great Plains in Texas, to help them solve some of the water problems they had. And this is kind of interesting. This is a billboard that was on I-94 back in the early 2000s, and you can see what it says. Back off, suckers. And the states of Texas, Utah, Arizona, California, New Mexico, all in this billboard have straws in the Great Lakes. So even though these projects in the U.S. have pretty much fallen into disrepute, I don't know who paid for this billboard, but that was in the early 2000s. Still concerned about it because there is water law there's just national law says states can't interfere with interstate commerce. And the Southwest states had made the claim that you can't prevent diversions from the Great Lakes or from other parts of your states because you're violating the interstate commerce clause. So far, that hasn't worked. No water is being taken out of the Great Lakes and sent long distances, nor are any of the plans being considered at this time. Okay, let me kind of see what trying to keep track of the time here. Okay, Culver River trip.
Pat?
Yeah, I just wanna, are the states that are protecting, together to protect our water, are they all dedicated to, no matter what, keeping it here, or are some of them less?
Well,
Repeat the question, please.
she wants to know, are the states, the Great Lakes states, that is the riparian, they border on the Great Lakes, they're united in being against the transfers, and the Canadians are against them. The biggest thing preventing it, I think, is the Canadians.
Yeah.
Because they have to have an agreement. The Canadians have huge shoreline on the Great Lakes, and they have the right to say something about the water taken out of it. Anyway, getting back to work, and former Soviet Union or activities. In 1976, there was a big conference, International Geographical Union, that met every 4 years, and this was in Moscow. And the people in the US who were arranging the American participation, US participation in it, much to their surprise, got the Soviet government to agree to a boat trip for American academics and other academics, whoever wanted to go from the West, take a cruise all the way, or part way along the Volga River. The Volga River is a big European river that flows into the Caspian Sea. So we went, prior to the main meeting, we went on this cruise on the Volga River. Really interesting. We started out on Rostov-on-the-Don, which you've heard about. It's because of the Ukrainian war, the destruction that's gone on there. And in any case, there was a canal, the Volga-Don Canal, which was built during Stalin's regime in the early 1950s. And we started in Rostov-on-the-Don, and we took the canal, which goes over the Volga River, and then we went up the Volga. It was a really interesting trip. There was a guy on the trip who had a gigantic camera lens. You know, this one's tough because you can get, he was photographing everything on the shoreline. Guess what happened to him? When he went to leave the country, they were waiting for him. Took his camera away and took his film. They thought he was a spy, and he may have been. And people were saying, don't photograph that. That's an industrial plant. They don't like it. And there were agents from the KGB on the boat, for sure. The guides that do the translating. They have no choice. They have to give any information they gain about foreigners at that time to the Soviet government. So that was an interesting trip. Research on the Aral Sea, that's been my main interest since the mid-1980s. And what happened is Gorbachev, after becoming Soviet leader in 1985, shut down work on the north to south river diversion projects, both in European Russia and in Siberia. And he said they were economically unjustified and environmentally dangerous. This, at least for the Siberian project, this was a huge shock to the leaders of the Central Asian nations, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, particularly Uzbekistan. They were counting on the Siberian diversions in order to have enough water to really expand irrigation a lot more than at the time. And they also were counting on it secondarily as a way to put water back into the Aral Sea, the body of water that I've worked on, because they were taking so much out from the rivers for irrigation, it was shrinking rapidly. The Central Asian leaders and the people felt they had been promised Siberian water if they just would plant more cotton. Cotton was it's a big crop, it still is for the Soviets. And Uzbekistan, for example, produced a huge amount of cotton. In any case, I participated in research exchanges in 1984 and 1987. 1984 was Senior Scholar Exchange at Moscow State University, which is, what can I say its equivalent would be in the United States? If you took Princeton and Harvard, put them together in terms of prestige, and added in a couple other major University. That would be the status Moscow State University had. Hard to get into, but very, very prestigious. Then in 1987, I went on a National Academy of Sciences exchange and worked at the Water Problems Institute in Moscow to study aerial issues. They had been assigned the task, along with the Institute of Geography, of studying what the effects of social and economic and other effects of the diversion projects might be, particularly the Siberian transfer projects. Okay. Well, the late 1980s was a time of expanded research opportunities in the USSR. Under the Gorbachev regime, cooperation between Western and Soviet science was much, much easier, particularly in the early 90s. The place was collapsing. Remember, what did they do? They kidnapped Gorbachev and held him, some military officers. The coup didn't succeed, but it was a time when it was very loose. It was probably the loosest and most free time ever known in the Soviet Union or in Russia. And I published an article on the Aral Sea in Science magazine. Science is the publishing organ for the American Association for the Advancement of Science. So it's a big honor to get, and I got the cover, the cover photograph. And a guy at the Zoological Institute in Leningrad, Micklin, saw it. I got an invitation to come for an expedition. I've got the wrong date. It wasn't in fall '89, the expedition was supposed to be. It was fall of 1990. Okay, a year later. In September 1989, I went with a team from the National Geographic to the Aral Sea. They were going to do a big story on it. And that was a really interesting experience. The guy running that took no guff. I mean, maybe that's the way they do other stories. He told these Soviet people that were organizing it for us, you gotta do that for me, you gotta do that. And he got really, really mad. He got what he wanted. They told us we could go to the Aral Sea, actually, and then we got down there and they said, no, you can't. And he called higher ups and pressure was put. They went clear up to Gorbachev, and we got permission to go to the Aral Sea. We went to the Aral Sea. And there was a story on the Aral Sea, and I tried to find my copy, but of course I couldn't come up with it. But it appeared in the early 1990s, I think February 1990 was a story on the Aral. Subsequent activities, well, I visited Central Asia and the Aral Sea numerous times since the easing of tension in the mid to late 90s, and of course the disintegration of the USSR in 1990-91. I was a member of the UNEP, United Nations Environment Program, Soviet Academy of Sciences diagnostic study group on the Aral from 1990 to 1992. We were supposed to look at what could be done to, quote, save the Aral Sea. And a bunch of conferences and visited a bunch of places, but when the Soviet Union broke up, it collapsed. The representatives from the new nations of Central Asia, they didn't want any part of a project that was run from Moscow, and this one was. Okay, I worked with the Japanese for a while. Outfit known Global Infrastructure Fund in the early 1990s. Got some trips to Japan And I went with him to Central Asia. And there were Japanese scientists on it, and American scientists, or anybody else, I think that was it. I spent the year 1996-97 as advisor on water management to the government of Uzbekistan, funded by USA. That sounds like a really important job. But I arrived in Uzbekistan. I met this guy who was the deputy minister of water management. And he said, "You can study, but we don't need your help at all. We don't need your help. Here's an apartment, they provided me with this really crummy office, and we ended up renting an apartment and making that into our office." And I understood why he said that. They had thousands of years of experience with irrigation. Here's Americans going to come and tell them how to fix their irrigation systems. They knew already. Anyway, I spent an interesting year. We had a couple of big conferences, and one of them on developing water user associations actually made a difference. They pursued that, and I think USAID or the American government provided some funding to them. And then I was awarded a National Geographic Society research and exploration grant that included or funded a 3-week expedition to the Arrow in September 2005. I organized this with the guy, Nick Aladdin, that I worked with and collaborated with for years, who was from the Zoological Institute. It was really interesting working with this guy. He was very talented, smart, taught himself English, spoke it pretty well, but oh, is he difficult to work with. He thought you had pocketfuls of money all over and could fund whatever he needed. And he took advantage of me in some ways, but I figured in the long run, he did as much for me as I did for him, so it was a balance. I don't really have much to do with him now, because I finally told him in 2018 or something, I can't do what you want me to. I'd done a lot before, and then he wasn't contacting me. Plus, at this time, wouldn't be smart for me to be in contact with them, because they're watching anybody, Soviet citizen, that has dealings with Westerners. So I wouldn't go back to Russia at this time. I'm afraid they might arrest me. Say, hey, we know you work for the CIA and you were a spy, and kind of interesting. And we had other shorter visits, 2007, 2011, 2017, and probably some others that I forgot about. Went back to the RLC, so I've been quite a few times. My last visit there was 2017. There's Central Asia, within Eurasia. Location of the RLC basin within Central Asia. The two rivers that flow into the RLC are the Sirdarya and Amudarya. And to say Sirdarya River, Amudarya River is actually repetitive. Darya means river in Turkic language, but that's just a convention. So I follow. Some of the equipment that I took, not all of it. The most valuable thing, what do you think it is? That it was, turned out, camera. A camera. So when I went to, we go any place, but I always took several cameras. Because back in the film era, of course, you run out of film, but the digital era, if something goes wrong or somebody steals your camera. So I found that to be one of the most important things for any research project. And a GPS, that's also important. You need to know where you take your photographs and stuff. And the GPS, they work fine there. Something that I took, that I found I couldn't use was the global water digital current meter. It worked fine, but the rivers that I was trying to measure were so large, it was, wouldn't work. And you have to have specialized equipment to measure the flow of those rivers. Well, you can see, there's the Amador. It's a big river. Its flow has been much diminished, but still, it's a big river. And so is the Sirdaria. This is the Amador is a southern river, and the Sirdar is a northern river. Okay, some of the things, I don't know if we were the first ones to find these out, but whatever. Lance imagery has also been extremely important in my research. And it's all free. You can get a ton of imagery online from the US government agencies, the United States Geological Survey, the National Aeronautical and Space Administration. You just go on and they've got directions on how to use their imagery, but it proved to be extremely useful. And what that left image shows is the old bed of the Sirdaria. That in the Middle Ages, the Aral Sea had shrunk from natural causes. The river had diverted itself, the Amudarya, and it wasn't flowing into the Aral Sea at that time. And they think that maybe the Mongol hordes had also had something to do with that. They diverted it to cut water off from some khanates, some kingdoms lower down in the Amudarya. And that's Micklin on the right there, the guy I worked with. He's sitting beside some ceramics, Middle-aged ceramics, 13th or 14th century. And where he's sitting, when the Aral Sea was full, let's say in 1950, 60 feet of water here. So it shows how much the sea dried over the decades since. There's some ceramics, and some of the scientific institutes interested in archaeology in Kazakhstan, where this part of the Aral Sea was, had done some studies on these. That we weren't the ones to first come up with it. They had found these sites and done a lot of work on them, analyzing. Changing profile of the Aral Sea. You can just see how it's really shrunken since 1960. It will never, in some magazine articles, they say that the Aral Sea will dry up completely by 2030. Nonsense. It'll never dry up completely. There's residual flow and meltwater and groundwater that will keep some water. There's some 1964 images, a spy satellite was put up by the US. And the other ones are imagery from more recent years. And I've got a very recent image there in the lower right, 6/27, June 27, 2023, and you can see, if you compare that to 1964, really a tremendous loss.
Is all of this then due to them taking the water out totally?
The majority is due to withdrawals.
Okay.
There was a dry cycle of years in the late 1960s and 70s, so that played some role. But it's 80% is sort of the figure they throw around, is attributable to humans taking out too much water for irrigation and not returning,
Thank you.
letting it evaporate from lakes that form in the desert, things like that. You can see there, that's outdated. I need to update that diagram, but it shows the trend. So the flow to the Aral Sea from the rivers has really dropped tremendously. And When the Aral Sea had a lot more water, it was heavily used for maritime transportation. And these are the boats. What happened is the sea shrank and the ports receded from anyone's ability to get there. They just left the ships where they grounded. And they're sitting all over the place out there. They are gradually disappearing because people are cutting them up for scrap metal. But this is a ship's graveyard near Moinak, which was a major seaport town in Uzbekistan. Actually, Karakalpakstan, which is a subunit, the big subunit in Uzbekistan. And in the north, there was a port of Aral, major port at the north end of the sea. And I don't have the date on here, but this picture was taken in the 2000s or in the 1990s. You can see cranes in the background. They were to unload railroad cars and put material from railroad cars onto ships and vice versa. But they aren't doing anything now. More ships out, sitting on the bottom. Fishing vessels was a big fishing industry on the Aral Sea. And then just other kinds of transportation. They're cutting up the ships, and guess where the scrap metal was being shipped? China. Yeah. I mean, they're relatively close to China, so they were shipping it there. Buhara deer have been adversely affected, so they have pinned some of them up, you know, to keep a breeding population. Salt dust storms are a huge problem in the Aral Sea region because the bottom of the sea is covered in many places with a mixture of sand and salt. And you get the wind howling, and it's flat, so you get strong winds. Then it picks up the salt and dust and deposits it downwind. So 2003, 2007, and a huge storm in 2008. And these causes are harming agriculture and human health. Breathing the air during one of these storms is not particularly good for you. And they've got problems. Here's a village. I don't remember which one around the former village around the Aral Sea. It's being buried by sand dunes. You know, they're just covering it. Well, French funded, this was when I was working for USAID. We visited some of these foreign aid, not our foreign aid, but other countries. Some of them was ours. And we visited this French-funded reverse osmosis drinking water purification plant. And the people in the Moinak, which used to be the major city on the southern coast of Aral Sea, were very grateful to the French for funding this. Okay, and then there's Vozrozhdeniya Island. Vozrozhdeniya in Russian means resurrection. This was called Resurrection Island. Why? Because when the sea went down, the island grew tremendously in size. And the U.S. knew way back in the 1950s, the Soviets were doing biological weapons testing on Vozrozhdeniya. Why did the Soviets do it there? Isolated. It was so isolated. And it was out in the sea. You know what's going to happen. Well, what happened is the sea shrank and it connected with the land, and everybody was concerned that these biological agents that we didn't think the Soviets had cleaned up, true, were going to get spread. Well, they thought terrorists were going to go there and get them. And what happened explained in this science article, we said, we'll give, this was to Uzbekistan, we said, we'll give you $6 million and we'll help you clean up these biological agents, and they did. We went in and it was true that the Soviets, when they left in a hurry, had done some cleanup, but not enough. But evidently now it's safe to go there, and people are going there. I knew people that had gone to it's all land now. They had gone to the Vajradeni Island to get scrap metal from the facilities. And the Soviets, when everything was operating out there, vis-a-vis the bioweapons testing activities, they had these high-speed patrol boats circling the island and keeping everybody away from it. Well, unless you had permission to go there. Oh, this is, the Soviets implement, not the Soviets, sorry. The government of Kazakhstan implemented a project to try to preserve or improve the condition of the small Aral Sea in the north. And this is the dam that they built. And I was there, May 30th, 2017, and it was a heavy flow year, so there was really a lot of water coming over this dam. And it's been, so far, a big success. It restored the fishery, lowered the salinity of the North Aral, and the fish almost immediately moved back into the what's called Small Aral Sea from the Sirdarya River. It's the Kokoral Dam. This is a picture from 2007, gives you a better idea. It was a dam 13 kilometers long. But this is the part that where the water is the water level is managed. They have gates that can lift and let the water out. And here's something we discovered, or I guess I did, won't take too much credit, that the water that's coming down the Sirdarya and going into the North Aral is actually dividing itself into two different flows. One is on the left there, where the salinity is 5 grams per liter, and the other is on the right, it's almost fresh. But the water is, they wanted it to stay in the North Aral, and a lot of it's just flowing south. Fish. This is a pike perch. In Russian they call it a sudak. Caught from the Aral in 1978. And these fish, the sudak, are still in the North Aral. And as the salinity has gone down, they've really come back and they form a big part of the fishery there. And these fish, these pike perch, are highly desired and highly valued in Europe. So the Kazakhstan government made an agreement with the European Union to export a large quantity of this fish into the European Union. That's a sudak. It is really a tasty fish. Here's a private fisherman. There's a lot of these. They go out in these little boats and catch whatever they can. And he's holding sudak in his hand. And on the right are flounders that were introduced into the North Aral. Why were they introduced? They were introduced in the Black Sea because as the salinity went up, the environmental conditions for these flounders, which are from the Black Sea, greatly improved. Now, with the salinity in the North Aral going down, the numbers of these flounders are dropping. But there's a very productive fishery in the North Aral Sea. Now, new fresh fish processing plant in Aral, they built it. And this is this is something I didn't know about, but I came across it. Artemia, or brine shrimp, if you have an aquarium, people take the dried eggs of the Artemia brine shrimp, throw them in, and they serve as food. Well, it's turned into a big industry. Guess where else it's a big industry? Great Salt Lake. They do a lot of harvesting of brine shrimp. And they're doing it now in Uzbekistan. Because as the salinity, the North Arrow salinity's gone down, way down. And it's what's left of the Southern Arrow, which isn't much, it's getting more salty and more salty. Bad for most organisms, but good for these Artemia. Yeah.
Pat, did they, and back on one of your things where it showed, you were showing the salt dust storms and everything, did they ever try, because salt is a precious commodity, did they ever try to,
Yes,
use,
harvesting.
harvest it, yeah,
They did,
but not
a
successfully?
problem was isolation of the region. The transportation costs were high, but they did. But a Belgian company came out and on the Kazakh part of the Aral Sea, they built a brine shrimp harvesting operation. But the last time we were out there, they told us, or they had shut it down because it wasn't economical. But I read this article where I got this information.
So brine
They're
shrimp
back
report.
doing brine shrimp again. Not the Belgians, but the Uzbek government.
Thank you.
There's a Artemia, a brine shrimp. The thing about them is the eggs are viable for years and years and years. They're kind of a scum of brown at the edge of the Aral Sea, and they gather them up and dry them out, and they will last for years and years and years. And they are a very good fish food, I mean commercial fish food. And that's some work I did, calculating how long it would take. Okay, if they had a certain flow into the North Aral Sea, which it's, according to my calculation, entirely possible, what it would lead to. And what it would lead to is the salinity dropping to an excellent level. And there was a big argument whether they had enough water, or could have enough water from the Sirdaria to do this. My guess is yes. And so I told them that. Who cares? Optimistic scenario there, I'll see in 2025. What it might be possible to do if they spent the money. But a big problem as far as the what remains of this right here is they discovered all kinds of oil and gas underneath the dried up parts of the Aral Sea. So Uzbekistan doesn't want to do anything to screw up, because it's much easier to drill on dry land from platforms out in the sea. So that's holding up any possibility, at least so far, of this plan for the large Aral Sea being implemented. And from what you could see in the images, recent images, the large Aral Sea is continuing to dry up because it's been low flow conditions on the Amur River. Publications, okay. That's the science. That's a picture from the shuttle of the Aral Sea, and there's my article. That was in 1988. And then in Scientific American, 2008, I, along with Micklin, were authors of this article. Then I did a book, I guess a monograph, although it was fairly long, Managing Water in Central Asia. And this was the proceedings of a conference, the first NATO Science for Peace conference in 1984 that I organized in Tashkent, which is the capital of Uzbekistan. And I did this in the late 80s. And this book that almost killed me, I edited it along with Aladdin and his deputy, but I'll tell you something, because I was angry about this. I did 95% of the editing. I ended up writing, there were 18 chapters, I wrote 8 of those. And Nick Aladdin was a strange guy. He just sort of said, he wouldn't have anything to do with this editing. I was gonna drop him from being listed as an editor, but the people published said don't do that, and I didn't. Kept the name on there. And the other guy, Igor, he's okay. He's Nick's assistant. Yeah, it's a big book, 400 pages or more than 400. And just some closing photographs. Fishing for white amur and sazan, grass carp. It's actually an irrigation drainage channel, but it supports fish. This is common. This is the Soviet equivalent of our Jeep. And they're four-wheel drive. They gotta get out and turn the axles to get it into four-wheel drive. But they break down too. And these guys are trying to fix it. And you can see the condition of the roads. They're really rough. Ships in the desert and ships in the desert. I thought it was kind of interesting. Some old vessels, and are those dromedaries or Bactrian? I'm not sure. The two of them. Anyway, camels are very, very important to people in the Central Asian republics. They keep them they eat them, but they use them for transportation. And you don't want to get too close to them, they'll kick you, and they'll spit on you and stuff. They just kind of roam free, but people know they've got markings on them saying who owns them. Our crew from 2005, Nick Aladdin, you can, I think, recognize me. And then we had a representative, the environmental officer from the U.S. Embassy in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, on the far left there. Ellen, I can't remember her name, yeah. She spoke very good Russian, I'll tell you that. And this is our NATO group. We went a number of times to Central Asia. And sort of typical, you throw a blanket out and have a luncheon. I hate to both of this. This is real life out in the desert. Sanitary facilities are pretty sparse. This outhouse was at the Institute on the former Barsa Kelmis Island, which is a nature preserve in Uzbekistan. It used to be an island, now it's like a plateau sticking up.
Phil, why is that outhouse taller than ours?
Well, maybe there's very tall people there.
Thank you.
All I know is that these are the kinds of things you have to face when you go to out in the rural areas of Central Asia. What the heck?
Can you tell them some stories about when you were living there? I remember you talking to us, first off, you got a pet once and brought it back.
Yeah,
And
cat.
then you couldn't go out at night because there were no lights and there were these huge holes in the road.
Right.
Just tell them about that. I think they'd love to hear it.
Yeah, there would be holes dug up for various things. And what would we do? We put up some barriers and lights. Nothing. You could walk along and all of a sudden you end up in a hole. That was in Tashkent. And people kept dogs, and they probably kept cats too, but there were lots of feral cats. Because the garbage collection, they had dumpsters that came through the garbage, and they came periodically and collected. Anyway, a cat from one of these feral cats attached himself to me. I lived in an apartment. And he'd come up and meow, meow, and there was this old Uzbek woman. Everybody speaks Russian, she didn't. I went on in the morning, and she'd be screaming at me about this cat. The cat's giving me awake and everything. Anyway, I ended up bringing the cat home. We had him for quite a few years, Blackie. And he was a survivor. He adapted very quickly to living here in the U.S. But he was different. Most of those cats, they wouldn't come near you. They were scared of you. But he came up. He must have maybe at one time been owned by somebody. Anyway, any other questions? Anybody else? I'll try to answer.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I wanna know how we measure lakes now. When I was growing up, Lake Manitoba was the 10th largest lake in the world, and I lived in Manitoba, so I was proud of that.
Yeah.
Sometime after the 1970s, it lost its standing, and I thought of this at the beginning when you were showing us that very deep lake.
Like
So-
my color.
Yeah, do we measure by area or by volume?
Well, it depends. When people are describing the Aral Sea, they say in 1960 it was the 4th largest lake in the world. It was 4th largest in size, but it's shallow, so in volume it was much less than that. So you need to specify, are you talking about volume or are you talking about area?
Thank you.
Baikal's, its area is smaller than probably Lake Superior, but it's so deep, it's got a huge amount of water. Very unusual lake, very unusual.
Any other questions?
Yes, did Connie go with you on any of these trips?
Yes,
Good.
she was in Moscow in 1984 with our daughter Claire.
Mhm.
She remembers that, probably some of it not too pleasantly. And she came in 1997 when I worked a year in Tashkent. You did, yeah. And my son came too. They didn't come together, they came separately, I mean, different times.
That was like when Chernenko was president.
In '84 was Chernenko.
Yeah. But anyway, all I remember is like Claire would turn on the television and it was, there's Chernenko.
Chernenko was the head of the Communist Party, which meant head of the Soviet Union in 1984 for a short period of time. And then he died, he was old, that's part of why they picked him. And Gorbachev, that's when he took over, and of course, Gorbachev really changed things, there's no question about that. For the better, he did.
Wasn't Andropov in there? Between
Yeah.
Micklin and Gorbachev?
He was before Chernenko.
Unfortunately.
And Andropov was head of the KGB, the Committee for State Security, which was the one that kept track of spies and academics who were spies like me. I wasn't a spy. They accused me of being a spy because of a program. I didn't mention that here. Primetime Live, does anybody remember Primetime Live? Well, I appeared on Primetime Live in 1990, February, along with Al Gore, because Al wrote that book, on whatever it is, and he had some stuff in there in the Aral Sea. And the guy who has managed the show kept trying to get me to you worked on, for the CIA on this, on the Aral Sea, and I said, no, I didn't, I was a lowly, analyst of photographs when I worked at CIA. Maybe they put that in the program, it was a lie. And I was so mad, I went to a lawyer, I said, I'm gonna sue him. And he said, good luck, you'll never win the case against the ABC or whoever it was. They did send me a letter kind of apologizing. Next time I went back to the Soviet Union, they said, oh yeah, we saw that program where he was caught. Luckily, that was the early 90s, and nobody gave a damn. They were all busy just trying to survive. But that did happen.
Any other questions? Thank you, Phil.
Okay.
There will not be a program in August. We're taking a summer break, and the real truth is I couldn't find a program. So we're calling it summer break. September 6th, Gerald Toshalis will speak on learning to be. See you September 6th.